All right, thank you, Jana. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited to share these brilliant minds with you. I've got a bunch of questions for them. We'll have a Q&A where you get to ask questions. But first, we want to orient you a bit to the work that they do. So Sean Barrett is a fisherman and the founder of Dock to Dish. Bren Smith is an ocean farmer and the founder of both Green Wave and Thimble Island Oyster Farm. And Sean has a short video to give you an idea of what he does.
What's really great about Dock to Dish and the restaurant-supported fishery movement is that we have
Should we move out of the way?
whatever comes in the last 24 hours is what we're good.
Oh, we're good.
We're good.
It's not demand-based, it's supply-based.
I feel like it's a collective awakening. We have been so far in depleting the planet and being disrespectful and being greedy. And today we are at a crossroad. It's not too late to change things.
Our whole premise is built on know your fisherman culture, right? So that you really should be entitled to know who caught your seafood.
We tend to associate deliciousness and enjoyment of food with some kind of gluttony, but actually the opposite is true. It's done with intelligent design. Gluttony is good in the pursuit of this kind of balance.
Not only does it inspire myself, but it inspires my cooks, my team, my brigade, right? My servers, my restaurant, basically.
So we're really excited about using Dock to Dish and Naka, and I've been looking for so long to find fish that are from California, and it's been very hard to source these ingredients.
The quality is top notch, because again, it's coming out of the water on Thursday and it's hitting us on Friday morning.
So we got two beautiful yellows. That's nice. With the food here and the species that we choose to serve, I try to do my best to keep the menu as sustainable as possible. And I feel a certain responsibility, I think, to try and really highlight wild American seafood.
It starts up high, and up high is in a white tablecloth restaurant. That's where the power of Dock to Dish comes in, because ultimately these ideas end up trickling down. It just takes a while.
For our next generation, we want to go back a few generations and see how this system looked before it broke.
So that's what Sean does. So the chefs in that video were really excited about the freshness of the seafood. And so the first time I saw this video, I was surprised because I didn't realize that was hard to come by. So what are their other sources? Like, how hard is it to get like fish that was caught within, 48 hours?
Good question. So it's really difficult in this country. I think there's the industrialized seafood system has got a lot of hands in the chain of custody. So yeah, that video kind of focused on, I was laughing because we're also so young. That was a few years ago. So the traditional chain of custody for seafood, which is what Dock to Dish was invented or presented to disrupt, is very long and opaque. And so for these chefs, it is very difficult for them to access, believe it or not, even in New York, very fresh fish. So that's one of the things that we hear our chefs talking about a lot, is just that freshness is really important to them. But I think the gist, or the reconnecting them directly with fishermen is really, or the fishing communities is really the whole objective. And freshness is kind of a byproduct of that.
So how many people in the audience are familiar with the CSA, Community Supported Agriculture? So Sean basically took that model and said, how about a community-supported fishery, a CSF? And so that's evolved into restaurant-supported fisheries, and now you're in how many communities around the world?
So I think we have now 8 Dr. Dish programs throughout North and Central America. We just opened an outpost in Fiji this spring.
This is a picture from Fiji.
Yeah, this is our all-female community supported fishery. These are the busa fishers of Bulia. And here's the busa fish you can see here. So yeah, we're kind of taking the concept of community supported agriculture and we translated that to community supported fisheries. The bulk of the work that we do is essentially just translating a lot of work that has already been done in the agricultural space, the progressive, sustainable agriculture space. And Dan Barber is a co-founder. Essentially, a lot of the work that we've done, we borrow a lot of his ideas. So Dr. Dish obviously is a play off farm to table. Community supported agriculture, we translated into community supported fisheries. Know Your Farmer became Know Your Fisherman. So a lot of our work is not original. It's adapted from the land, but now we're taking that model.
So you were like that, but in the ocean.
Exactly, the saltwater version of that.
Awesome. So, and Bren, you've done a similar thing with how can we take farming to the ocean. So you have a few photos that you wanted to share with us, and then we'll just have a freewheeling conversation. So tell us what this is.
For the basics. I just say everything, I think, in the ocean space and seafood is, 20, 30 years behind discussions and debates and vision on land. I mean, there's just so much learning to be done, but also I think innovating and not making the same mistakes we've made on land. So I'm born and raised in Newfoundland, commercial fisherman, fished in Lake Gloucester all the way up to the Bering Sea, height of industrialized fishing, worked on the aquaculture farms. And then probably 15 years ago now, I went on a just try to figure out what does the ocean want us to grow. And so instead of trying to grow what wants to swim away and that we have to feed based on what people have always eaten, let's just listen to the ocean and say, what is an agricultural, what does this look like as an agricultural space? So what we've come up with is what we're calling 3D ocean farming. And I started as an oysterman, and I will not say anything about oysters because Pete Malinowski's in the room, who runs the Billion Oyster Project and the most innovative oyster sort of project in the country right now. But draw 20 acres, let's figure out all the species we can grow that are zero input and won't swim away, right? And so we start, basically the structure is we have hurricane anchors on the edges of the farm. This was drawn by a high school student of ours, so it kind of looks like it. Hurricane-proof anchors on the side, and then just lines or ropes down below the surface, about 6 or 7 feet. And then you use that scaffolding system to grow as many species you can. We have our kelp growing vertically downwards next to scallops and lantern nets, mussels and mussel socks, cages with oysters down on the bottom, and clams in the mud. So let's just run through a couple of pictures, just to give you a sense of what it... So here's the kelp. One of the fastest growing plants on Earth. There are over 250 species, but this is just the beginning. There are over 10,000 edible plants in the ocean. So if you don't like kelp, we'll find something else that you like. If those kelp dumplings are disgusting to you, we just, this is the beginning of the search. That soaks up 5 times more carbon than land-based plants and is really the thing that breathes life back into the ocean. These are the end of a mussel harvest, but this is just a rotational crop. Once we harvest our kelp, we get mussel sets, and then we take those and put them in mussel socks on that same kelp line.
And these are Bren's big bicep muscles over here that we'd like to share.
A lot of muscles in this photo. Yeah. Where is this?
So unbelievable. This is Long Island Sound, so this is farming the urban sea, and we can talk about later about pollution and things like that, but it's in Branford, Connecticut, and which is probably, Connecticut might be the worst place in the world, but it's where I farm. So here's oysters. This is me probably, a decade ago or something. All the things that Pete will tell you about terroirs, tastes, I was a terrible farmer. I started out as a fisherman, and I kill and hunt things. And oysters are like this meditative, zen-like arugula farming thing. It's the most boring thing you can do. But I had to learn and change my nervous system and look for detail and read the water in very different ways. And
Wait, can we take a time out on you had to change your nervous system? So this wasn't about hunting and killing anymore. This was meditative and cultivating. So how did that change?
I think outside of
you?
Brooklyn, we just call that boring. but yeah, I mean.
Were there flutes involved?
Yeah, I mean,
incense?
I always say, like, what am I gonna hang out at Elbow Room in the bar in Dutch and like tell stories about this amazing kelp blade I pulled up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I get beat up, right?
So actually, this is very interesting to me because when a lot of people talk about ocean conservation, they talk about the need to transition from catching wild fish to marine protected areas or to ocean farming. And it really is like a very different personality that's required. If you think about turning fishermen into arugula farmers, that's like a completely different mindset, right? It's the, I'm not tied to any one place, I am my own boss, I do what I want, I like conquer, I face the elements, and instead you're like, well, if the weather's bad today, I could just go pull my kelp tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how are fishermen reacting to this shift? Is there an embrace of it as the future, or are people just like, that's not for me?
I mean, so we have 11th generation fishermen out of Rhode Island. We got former lobstermen. I've got folks up in Alaska that are crab fishers. So they are coming. What's really interesting, I mean, but this is a very frank conversation we have with people. Say we have to say goodbye to parts of our profession. The question is, what's the soul of a fisherman? And I don't know what everybody else, but for mine, it's yes, the thrill of the hunt, but it's also living a self-directed life, not having a boss, making a living on the water, and also the pride of feeding your country. And we can keep almost all of those. So we can still have jobs that we can sing songs about and jobs with meaning, and I think that's the goal. But
Do you have a kelp song for us?
No. Not yet.
I get by with a little kelp from my friends. You can adapt it.
Yeah.
And I've done
Let's
it to
go.
Brent a couple of times. It's at karaoke night, and he leaves.
Stay for cocktails afterwards. We'll see what we can spin up.
It gets ugly.
Okay. What else do we have here?
These are just
Scallops?
baby scallops. But again, it's all it is just trying to figure out all the things we can grow in 20 acres that don't swim away.
So this is really interesting, just in case this wasn't clear from the diagram. So in one vertical column of the ocean, you can grow so much stuff because it's not like a field that's only 2 dimensions. You have 3 dimensions to grow in, and you've invented this system for farming all 3 dimensions.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about the ocean is that you don't really have to fight gravity. So you can just have very simple scaffolding rope systems, and that sort of ecological design, that architecture underwater has been, I think, really important. And then as long as you pick the correct crops, you get ecological benefits. But what I care about as a farmer is that it's really cheap. It's like rope, buoys, anchors. I don't have to get any fish feed. I don't need any fertilizer. I don't need water. And it's $50 an acre to grow.
And this is what it looks like on the surface.
Yeah. So this
You'll
is like
notice also, is there like a pointer on here? It says kelp is the new kale on his shirt. So we're also very witty on this stage.
So this is just a corner of it, but one of the keys is because everything's about 8 feet below the surface, anybody can boat and fish and swim over the farm. And this is really important compared to sort of traditional salmon aquaculture where you have pens and things like that. This is actually a community space. So we're able to permit a lot more easily, faster, and we're become protectors of the commons. I don't own that water. All I own is the right to grow shellfish and seaweed. No one else can do those 2 things. I've got gill netters, I've got conch fishermen, people dive through the kelp forest. I mean, this is a welcoming place, and that's so important. Our oceans are these beautiful, pristine places. They're the commons, and as ocean farmers, we're able to keep them that way and actually be protectors.
Awesome. Super into all of that. So I have a question for you that you've been asked a zillion times, and I'm going to ask you to give me a different answer than you've ever given before.
Oh, man.
How did you end up doing this? I know this is a question you're constantly asked. How did you end up being a fisherman and starting these community-supported fisheries? And how did you pioneer ocean farming? And we all have kind of our rote, like, this is how I became a marine biologist. I have this story. But there's like another version or like a secret twist you only give to people after your sea shanties are done. And you're like, the real reason I'm doing this is...
I chased a woman to the worst place in the world, which is Long Island Sound. No, I mean, it's true. And then I literally moved in. My first day, she was in the car, and I went into Dunkin' Donuts to get a cup of coffee, and the police came and asked, "Are you all right, ma'am?" It was in Guilford, Connecticut. And then moved into an Airstream trailer for 7 years, which was supposed to be a year. And I tried to grow carp in my Airstream trailer in a deep depressive stage. And then
I have been on a panel with him before. I have never, ever heard this story.
your question.
No,
But
I
anyway,
love it.
that's
Keep
the-
going.
no,
What
and then-
happened next?
And that, of course, didn't work. And then was literally in the paper was a thing about them opening up shell fishing grounds for the first time in 150 years in my area, and so that was the start. But it was out of it was bad times.
So it's a story of love, an Airstream trailer, and a newspaper ad.
Yeah.
Sean?
Mine's not nearly that cool. And I rarely admit this. It's nerdy, and they just both teased me about this upstairs. We were in the middle of a conversation. I was like, "Did you read that book?" And "Did you read that book?" They're like, "Dude, you read so many books."
We welcome literary minds here.
Right. So
Bring
I love
all
to
of
read.
your nerdery
I
to
love
Pioneer
to
Works.
read, and Ayana and Bren like to make fun of me for it. But that was kind of an intersection I hit. Was I read this amazing book called "This Common Ground" by a farmer, Scott Chasky in Amagansett. He's kind of the grandfather of CSAs in this country, and it was about the operations of a organic CSA, but it was also about he's kind of a farmer poet and had a philosophical kind of spiritual gist to it that I really it was very compelling to me, and I immediately recognized a lot of the work he was doing on the farm. I'm trying to look for the love story in here, Bren. There just is none.
It was poetry.
It was poetry, yes, exactly. So
This is where books will get you.
I can't admit that story often, though, in certain company, because on fishing docks and around fishermen, if you talk about, your nerdy fish books or farmer books.
So you actually wrote, and I quote, "I make no secret that Scott Chasky's vision, philosophy, and métier have inspired my life's work. I am forever mindful that his book, The Common Ground, was the catalyst on my journey to launch Dr. Dish." So this is consistent with what he has published on the
It's
internet.
true, yeah. That was a text I sent
She just
Ayana.
pulled that quote out.
I'm very well prepared. Watch out. And we also have one of Scott's books in the back, right? His newer
Yeah.
one?
Yeah, there's 2 books that I recommended, and to my shock, surprise, here they are.
So if anyone doesn't get all the answers they need tonight, there are 3 books available in the back. This Seed Time. Do you want to say anything about Seed Time?
Seed Time is Scott's second book, which is obviously about seeds, and it's kind of what we're seeing now is
You were afraid to read it for fear of the extent to which it would change your worldview.
Yeah. I had no idea about seeds and agriculture, but I saw Barber and Chasky were hyper excited about this and really going crazy 4 or 5 years ago about seeds. But it's kind of, that's jumping forward in the story. I think Bren and I's work has weaved together in the past few years, and now that book was more of a kind of homage to Bren's work in kelp and the nursery work that he's doing with growing kelp. So when you said, what are your 2 favorite books on this blended topic, I think The Third Plate, I regularly I go to work with this under my arm a lot, and I just think this is...
So the last time I hung out with this guy who's wearing a corduroy blazer with elbow patches and had Werther's Originals in his pocket, so I'm just imagining the book tucked in there too.
Yeah, exactly, and a little corncob pipe. But Bren and I ultimately, to sum this all up visually, the way that we talk about our work together is if you go back 50 years and look at a plate of seafood in the United States, it would be a very apex predator, swordfish, cod, a very protein-heavy slab, an enormous serving of finfish. And if you fast forward to modern day, you'll see servings of wild fish have gotten much smaller, typically 4 or 5 ounce servings, and the plate is filled with local agricultural grains and greens. But if you fast forward 50 years, what you'll see is that finfish part, the wild finfish part, will be almost a garnish size, a 1 or 2 ounce small serving, and the rest of that plate will be ocean farms, restorative ocean farmed greens. So it's interesting in the fishing and agriculture space and kelp growing space, restorative aquaculture space, how those are kind of weaving together. And so Dan's book and Scott's book give you a really good kind of foundation there.
And Bren, you recommended a book with a very long title, Ocean Greens, Explore the World of Edible Seaweed and Sea Vegetables, a Way of Eating for Your Health and the Planet. What? Tell us more. Well, yes, I did recommend that book.
It's done by Europeans. That's probably why they couldn't come up with a 4-word subtitle. But I think it's the best book out there on desutrifying sea vegetables.
It's a cookbook.
It's a cookbook with some stories, but it's mainly a cookbook. And I just think, a lot of the other cookbooks will just substitute kale for anything, just like, and throw in some kelp. This really dives into, I think, the terroirs, like what are the particular flavors of different regions when you get to sea vegetables, and textures, mouthfeels, but really desutrifying. So how do we think of it as a Western cuisine? And one of the interesting things about sea greens is that there is this entire lost history, culinary history of seaweeds in the West. So it was a standard meal for Italians 3 generations ago, Irish. There was the kelp highway running all the way up South America, was a core food. In Newfoundland, where I'm from, freshest vegetables, of course, were always seaweeds, and it was used always in different agricultural products as feed and fertilizer. So we think of it as an Asian cuisine. But I think it's more that our approach to those foods in the ocean just got pushed off the plate by industrial food.
So I was in Ireland last summer, and I heard something that I have not been able to verify as much as I would like, which was that one of the ways the Irish got through the potato famine was by eating seaweed. Mm-hmm. This is true.
Yep.
How come that's like not enough of a reason that we're all like embracing this?
I know they always get blamed for eating dirt. It's like ran out of potatoes, then they ate dirt, but there was seaweed too. Yeah.
So you mentioned also that seaweed could be used as a fertilizer and as animal feed. And I have a fun fact to share with you. It's my favorite fun fact for the week. Cows fed certain seaweed species belch 58% less methane, which is significant because methane is at least 34 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. And given the IPCC report that was just released, this is more important than ever. So if we want to be eating beef, we should be feeding our cows seaweed?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm never going to eat seaweed. I got no interest in eating it at all. But we don't have to. What? I'm not I eat at the gas station most nights. I'm not a foodie. I'm not it just isn't my world. But the reason I believe in sea vegetables so much is that it's like the soy of the sea, but not evil, right? The soy industry met in the 1950s or something and said, we're never going to get Americans to eat soy, so we'll put it in everything, right? And that's where we have today, and that's the industry we have now. Soy, of course, is problematic for a whole range of reasons. Kelp and seaweeds in general can be used for food, but also fertilizer, animal feed, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals. It used to be used for mustard gases in World War I. It's being turned into biofuel. We can weave it into all.
You can 3D print surfboards with it?
Mm-hmm. I guess so. I don't know.
That is a thing that is happening.
I don't know if I want to live. This world.
Here are my crotchety old ocean friends.
Here's the trouble with sustainability generally is just about making bad things better. That's what aquaculture and fish farming is. It's like you've got a species that poops a lot, that wants to swim away, that you have to feed a lot, and they've made incredible progress making sure that's more sustainable and a better industry. We start from the other way and ask, what can we do to restore the planet, restore the seas, breathe life back into the oceans? And how do we really become climate farmers? Because that's really just the central question, right? And not only are we capturing carbon on the farm, but because the cattle feed thing, which has just been, new studies at University of San Diego are showing, are verifying all the studies, and there's now a
and
huge
UC
push.
Davis did some of the preliminary work.
Some incredible work, and then just the numbers are shocking. So as much as we can break down that barrier between land and sea, and all the land-based inputs that we can grow in the ocean that take no fresh water, no fertilizer, no feed, no land, and use that to grow our land-based proteins and plants, huge net benefit in the era of climate change.
So I would like to quote you on that, as you've written in The Atlantic, maybe? The real kicker is these low-maintenance ocean plants and animals require no fresh water, no deforestation, and no fertilizer, all significant downsides to land-based farming. Plus, they improve water quality, absorb carbon, reduce ocean acidification, and create habitat for other species. And then I have a fun fact for you on the aquaculture side, which is there's new research showing that a diet containing shellfish actually has a lower carbon footprint than being vegan, because it's such an efficient way to produce protein.
Awesome. I hate vegans. It's so good. I dated a vegan once and it went really bad. So I just
Sean,
now
do you have any romances gone wrong that have influenced what you eat and grow and catch?
Not yet.
Okay, we'll work on that. Every conversation is about love, even the ones about, especially the ones about the ocean. So we've got let's take a zoom out to the big picture a little bit. So I have some information, and I'd love to hear how this does or doesn't contextualize the work that you do, how people react to your work in this context. And just for you to know why I'm so impressed with their work and find it so important. So first is about overfishing. So over the last 40 years, fish populations around the globe have declined by 50%. So in the last 40 years, we're 50% down in the amount of fish that's in the ocean. And about 33% of fish populations are overfished. Another 60% are maximally fished. So we have already reached also peak fish. We cannot catch more fish. We have used all the tools of war. We have used sonar and radar and spotter planes and depth sounders to try to find more fish, going into deeper waters and further from shore, and yet our catch has been declining since 1996. So to me, this is really sobering information, right? You would think if we just got better at it, we could catch more fish, but we've actually passed that point. So Sean, how does this frame the work that you do? Because you're still out there killing fish, and you know about all of this information, obviously. So tell us how this frames and informs the way that you do what you do.
Okay, great question. So I think there's two distinct conversations here about global fisheries. Is a very different story than U.S. fisheries. The United States has the best managed fisheries in the world, is seen as a beacon of light around the globe. For the opposite of what Ayana just described on a global perspective is true in the U.S. So in the Mid-Atlantic region where we are here, since some legislation was passed in the 70s, over the last 40 years, we've actually rebuilt. We're just about 40 different species of fish on the eastern seaboard anyway, in the Atlantic, that are rated sustainably by NOAA, that are managed under management programs by NOAA. So underlying all of the science, which I love, Ayana and I are both science lovers, but I think to count fish is where the science is based. So first you have to take a stock assessment, and the analogy that people will say is that's kind of like counting the leaves on the trees, except they're invisible, they're underwater, and they move, and they eat each other. So
Counting fish is super hard.
counting fish is super hard. So it's very difficult. A lot of the statistics and things that come out, you have to look at the underlying math and how they came to that. So in the US, we err on the side of caution. And I think what we have is very robust fisheries, but a dramatic diminishing or decreasing community-based fishermen. So we really don't have, does anyone here know a commercial fisherman? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 10. Yeah, it's the same guy, right? He's your Facebook friend, I'm sure.
Okay, of those of you who know one, how many of you are like in the business of ocean conservation or like restaurants? Okay, so there are a
Cool.
few of you who know a
Keep up the
fisherman
good
and are
work.
not like, this is not your job. That's great.
Yeah, that's
And,
great.
and
yeah.
very rare.
But this is also probably about the 1% of the 1% who would know or have those type of connections.
You
So
are all very special.
there's just not a very, it's a dying industry. So commercial fishing in the U.S., I think the average age is 59. There's no new entries. So we have very few
And
fishermen.
Bren, for farmers, it's like 65 on land. Yeah.
Very few fishermen, but a lot of now healthy, robust fish stocks. So that kind of lends us to the advice or suggestions that we give to people is if you are going to eat wild seafood, try to make sure that it's wild U.S. And that it's under a management program. And then the way that we manage those stocks is essentially the way if you had a bank account and you kept the principal the same. I think Brent lives a lifestyle like this. And you just take off the interest, that's the way the U.S. government manages our fish stock. So the commercial fisheries are only allowed to harvest out of what would be considered the interest off of the base biostock. So the whole goal being ultimately, even defining sustainability, what does that mean, is that future generations will have the same or greater access to the resource as we currently do now.
So on the farming side, on the aquaculture side, and I love that you call it ocean farming, by the way, because what is aquaculture?
I mean, aquaculture, it's the worst brand name in the grocery store, right? I mean, they completely screwed it up. It's like, it'd be like trying to rebrand the death tax, right? It's just not happening. So I mean,
It sounds a little bit extreme, but we'll go with it. So ocean farming, it's increased a lot. So from 1974, when 7% of the fish for human consumption was produced by aquaculture, and now in 2016, it was up to 53%. I don't have the numbers for seaweeds, but that's a really big shift. And so we're starting to see aquaculture come to the fore, and we're starting to see a lot of people get more comfortable with the fish part of it. And you mentioned earlier that like that's still not great. So why are you not such a huge fan of farming fish?
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, to make fish farms profitable needs to be monoculture. I believe firmly in polyculture systems. I think Mother Nature abhors monoculture. She fights back. And that requires more pesticides, more antibiotics, stronger netting and cages and things like that. And I mean, there was just a massive escape in Washington State. They then banned salmon farming completely. Alaska, I think the jury's still out how society feels about it. And since our food system's being pushed out to sea, clearly, and our wild stocks can't handle that additional pressure, the question is, what's that farming going to look like?
So embrace diversity, just like we're starting to see with permaculture and regenerative farming on land.
I think what's really interesting, I didn't expect this, in that I thought it would all be sort of folks like me, like white working class fishermen who wanted to transition out or want to diversify income. And we have a lot of those. We get tons of fishermen come to us. We have requests to start farms in every coastal state in North America, 20 countries around the world. There's like a lot of intense requests, but the majority are women. Fascinating, right? And that's up and down. That's hatchery, that's farmers, that's entrepreneurs starting, new salsa, sea greens companies, things like that. It's the scientists. I mean, my organization, Greenwave, which is a nonprofit which trains the new generation ocean farmers, 70% women. So the fascinating thing is this actually a space that could become female-run, owned? It's not about equity, like more women into the field, but the oceans are a blank slate. We can build this economy from the bottom up. We can weave the DNA, weave its DNA in a totally unique way. What happens if this is the first industry ever completely sort of shaped and driven by women?
I'm not against that. I would say that the next generation of ocean scientists is dominated by some pretty badass women too.
Yeah.
We may have a secret listserv.
That's right.
So you mentioned that you're training folks. So you have two organizations, Greenwave and Thimble Island Ocean Farm. So Greenwave is a training. Tell us a little bit about how that works.
Sure. So, Created Green Wave, it's a nonprofit, and its role is really to do three things. Have a training program, we do a lot of policy work, and we do a lot of research and development. And it's really designed to replicate the model, take the 3D farming model and spread it, give people the skills needed to start their own farms. We operate in New England, we're in Alaska, Pacific Northwest, and California now. And our farmer training program, just to give you a sense of one of the pieces of it, you get, it's a need-based small grant, you get free seed, winter gear from Patagonia, permitting support from our lawyers, and 2 years of consulting, and we come out and help set up a farm, you come for a training, things like that, and then we're able to connect folks, people like Sean, to buyers to guarantee purchasing up to 80% of what folks grow. So that's the package.
So another reason that people are caring about this is that there's a food security issue, right? Like, how are we going to feed ourselves with a growing population and in a healthy way? And globally, in coastal communities, often 70% of the population relies on seafood for their primary source of protein, and fishing provides livelihoods for 11% of the world's population globally. So we think of it as like a faraway thing that not many people do, but globally, like 11% of the population relying on fishing and 70% relying on seafood for their protein in coastal communities. Those are really huge numbers. So how do you see your work being a part of our meeting food security needs?
You're going to throw that one at me, huh, Ayana? All right.
I have lots more very easy questions.
Yeah, that was a good one. I think, so we've just begun weaving into, so the Fiji program, for example, community-supported fishery programs are really designed to preserve a lot of the small community-based fisher folks. But what we've learned, and Bren and I were laughing about it a little bit earlier, is that years ago when we first started out on our tracks, we've been good friends for a number of years, but we used to have two very kind of polarized messages, and I was very much wild seafood, finfish, and Bren's message has not really changed. But through over years of me getting clobbered over the head by just his science and facts and, the reality that...
You read a few books.
I read a few books.
They were very poetic.
Yeah, I watched his 60 Minutes. I don't know if anyone caught that. But, I started to soften and kind of see a clearer vision of the future of seafood, what we consider categorically to be seafood. And there was just no way that I could scientifically get around what the work that he was doing. So I started to wave the white flag a little bit, and he was like, okay, let's work together on some stuff. And that plate that I described, that kind of third plate, that 50-year from now plate of seafood, I think as far as food security is concerned, if you imagine what that plate of seafood looks like, where there's smaller, artisanal, community-based, sourced, sustainable, low-trophic forage fish like the Busa fishers, and that's your protein on the plate, and then Bren's work essentially absorbing the other 80 to 85% of the plate. I think that in that plate is where a lot of the answers, including food security, are going to come from. Climate cuisine, he likes to call it.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned trophic. And so for those who are not ecology nerds, trophic level is like the level that you are in the food chain. And so if you start with phytoplankton and zooplankton and like tiny fish and bigger fish and sharks and people, the ocean is a place where we eat at a much higher trophic level than we do on land. So we don't eat any really carnivores on land. We're not like eating wolves and bears, but we are eating tuna, which are like at the 5th or 6th trophic level, depending on how you think about it. So we're actually, if we were thinking about what we're eating on land and comparing it to the ocean, we would basically be like eating whatever eats dragons, like that's a tuna. Which you can imagine isn't sustainable, right? So it's interesting because we have just completely different expectations from the ocean as we do from the land. We expect to be able to eat tuna with impunity forever, even though it's this like wild, majestic creature. So we have tuna and salmon and shrimp as the 3 most popular types of seafood in America. A question I always get asked when I introduce myself to someone new and they find out I'm a marine biologist, they're like, oh my God, like in Seinfeld? I'm like, no, like I got a PhD and it was really hard and not like that at all. And then they ask, well, what seafood can I eat and feel good about? And so those are the top three, right? Tuna, shrimp, salmon, those are the most popular. Should we be eating those?
No.
That was pretty clear.
Yeah.
So I've sort of said why not, but is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of other better options. I think by the nature of how a community-supported fishery or a restaurant-supported fishery work, over the years, we began as a community-supported fishery, then elevated up to a restaurant-supported fishery model. And that has since expanded to these chefs that you saw in the video, but also the Google Corporation became one of our institutional members. And what we became kind of well known for was underutilized species. We absolutely ask you to please never use the term trash fish. It's underutilized species, and so there's, those three popular species of, on an average season for Dr. Dish, there's probably 40 different species of abundant, local, lower trophic often species that are accessible, that are, healthy, sustainable, all those things that you're looking for. People just don't know about them, especially American culture. Americans, if you look at per capita seafood intake, we're not a very seafood-centric culture. The average American eats about, I think, 15 pounds of seafood a year, as opposed to an Asian, Japanese, or Chinese, I think, is over 100 pounds per year. We're very beefy in the United States. It's if you look at the per capita.
I have a fact about this.
Yeah.
Global average seafood consumption has increased 3.2% a year since 1961, outpacing population growth, which is 1.6, and growth of meat consumption from terrestrial animals, 2.8. So seafood consumption has grown from about 9 kilograms a year in 1961 to about 20 in 2015, and it's still going up. So what we're talking about here is like, well, what does that seafood include, right? And I'm really curious also about like what that means. So we mentioned salmon and tuna and shrimp, and at least for tuna and shrimp, there's some pretty serious human rights concerns and abuses associated with those fisheries. Can you share a little bit more about sort of like the dirty side of fishing?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Well, our whole mantra of know your fisherman and the whole direct connection and having identity and having traceable, verifiable traceability and transparency. The future of wild seafood is very much centered upon traceability and transparency. And if you don't have that in your supply chain, you end up with, a whole litany of just horrible, in a very long international global supply chain like that, you end up with some of the worst things you could imagine going on in imported seafood. So the statistics around our imports, unfortunately, most of you guys know, over 90% of our seafood is imported in the US right now. And so none of it, basically, I think 2% gets inspected by the FDA before it enters the food supply. And
of that 2%, like what they
something crazy, like
some crazy
60%
amount is rejected
sent
for
back,
being contaminated,
unsanitary, usually, yeah. So it is just by the numbers. If you look at seafood by the numbers, the state of seafood in the United States right now, it's a dire, kind of scary situation. Brent and I were talking before about how most people, they get all this information, they go, you know what? I'm gonna have chicken. And you just kind of don't want to deal with all of the... So what we're really emphasizing, and our whole mantra, we've been kind of, all of our efforts are focused around know your fisherman, about having a direct line of transparency and traceability to where your seafood's actually coming from. And from there cascades a whole series of benefits. Whether it's freshness, sustainability, the way the fish is handled, that you just see, we have a pretty fearsome loyalty to the Dr. Dish programs. And so, yeah, I would strongly advise anyone to, if you have unnamed, like if you don't know where it's coming from, if you can't answer basic questions about your seafood, you probably are better off ordering the chicken or the kelp.
If only kelp was on every menu. So this, I mean, Bren, this reminds me of what you were saying earlier. Like, we really just are 3 decades behind the farm to table movement when it comes to the ocean. And the same is true when it comes for how we manage the ocean in some ways, because we've figured out how to zone the land, but we're still sort of figuring out how to do spatial planning in the ocean. So one thing I just wanted to share with you that I learned recently was that we have, for shrimp in particular, we have, if you don't know where your shrimp came from, it was quite possibly peeled by slaves in Southeast Asia. Like, this was a huge expose that the Associated Press did a few years ago, and I was really shocked because on top of that, the fact that they're growing these shrimp in these coastal ponds where they're bulldozing mangroves, which are what protects you from tsunamis and storms, and where the baby fish would normally grow. So there is such thing as bad aquaculture for sure, even along the coastlines, whether it's about human rights or sustainability or ecological integrity. So how do we help people separate between the good and the bad when it comes to ocean farming?
Let me just say one thing about, I think there's something we shouldn't learn from land, besides, all the obvious sort of Monsanto-ish sort of and sort of highly industrial practices. The new land-based food economy is not working. Like, your little farmers markets are just, no one's making a living. 91% of farmers lost money, and my last number is 2012, and over 90% of farmers made the majority of their income off farm, right? So you go to your farmers market, you're supporting your farmer, folks are not making a living, and the ones that have soft subsidies.
My mother calls herself a pension farmer. To be clear that she can't, she would have to charge $19 a dozen for her eggs to break even.
Exactly. It is like we've done incredible things in the food movement over the last decades. Food is now the center of discussion. Who would ever guess that in America? The economics we have not figured out. And so one of the things we're really hoping to do in the ocean is really think about replication and scale. Like, what would it look like to create millions of jobs? If you were to take less than 5% of U.S. waters and dedicate them just to restorative ocean farming, the World Bank says it would create 50 million jobs.
Can you say that again, but into the microphone?
Oh, sorry. So the World Bank says if you were to take less than 5% of U.S. waters and dedicate them to restorative ocean farms, you'd create 50 million direct jobs and the protein equivalent to 3 trillion cheeseburgers, right? It's like, no, but I'm a fisherman. I was a steel worker of the sea in the Bristol Bay. I used to make $60,000, $70,000 a year. And we need good middle-class jobs to solve a lot of the political problems we face in this country and give ladders of equity and things to folks that have been left behind in the Industrial Revolution. And I think our oceans are our chance to do agriculture and food the right way on the economic side. Our vision of what this might look like is what we call green wave reefs, which is 50 small-scale farms. This is networked production. It's not, 1,000-acre banana plantations. So networks of 50 farms, a seafood hub, hatchery in a struggling community on land, a ring of institutional buyers like Google, universities, and entrepreneurs, and then you take that green wave reef and you just keep replicating it. And to me, that's what scale looks like. And that's when we get out of this sort of cute little 3 or 4 jobs here, part-time supplemental income. Like, food is the second biggest employment sector in the United States. Like, if we can shift the food piece into a real sort of beautiful, productive, just economy, then maybe the other industries will follow suit.
So you've taken a similar approach with your work, which is like, how do we sort of trickle down this this model? So you've started by working with Blue Hill and Le Bernardin. So like, how does that work? Because when I read about what you're doing, it seems like you're trying to sort of instigate culture shift from this like haute couture perspective. Is it working?
We hope it's working. It seems to be working. In wild seafood, you can't really scale up. So you saw a rapid expansion of Dr. Dish out. We started to move horizontally and set up different programs all across.
That's super interesting. Let's pause there for a second, because what Bren is talking about is how do we get scale? How to create millions of jobs, how to create literally tons and tons and tons of shellfish and seaweed. And you're saying that catching wild fish will just never be that.
No. So
It's
it
a
won't.
garnish.
Yeah, it's gonna. Imagine in your mind, Ayana, that third plate 50 years from now, we're moving in that direction. So, yeah, we tried every which way about how to grow, but to keep sustainability in focus, was just not an option. So, yeah, Bren's got the answer. I mean,
So I was hoping this would be like a debate about
used to
catching
be.
fish versus growing
yeah.
seaweed. And then Sean emails me being like, nope, we all just need to eat more kelp. And I was like, what are we going to talk about?
Yeah.
Just one other thing I think we're going to face is the wild fish issue, but then there's the climate economy, which is going to drop, obviously drive up the cost of land-based food. So, the price of water or fertilizer, feed, of land, all these things are going to go up. If you can grow zero input food, it's going to be the cheapest food on the planet. So sea green shellfish I really believe this, going to move to the center of the plate because the economics are going to move them there. The question is, can we make it delicious, beautiful food and just as joyful as our meats and our wild fish?
And Sean's now distributing kelp.
Yeah, Brandon and I have full on.
I did not know they were like in cahoots before I invited them to speak.
Yeah, it used to be we would battle back and forth, but over the last 3 years.
I'm sorry if you're disappointed. This is
It's
not
good,
a
it's
battle.
harmony, it's peace.
It's a
You'd
goddamn
rather
love
that.
fest up here.
No, but I think we've found solutions between each other's work, and I think that's really important.
So I have one last question for you before we go to the audience for questions, and that is around this topic of seafood fraud. Because I'm seeing your prop that you have here, always prepared. So tell us the story of seafood fraud in New York that there was just a recent expose about, and then how you're trying to make sure that you create another way.
Okay, so seafood fraud, and cut me off, Ayana, because I could go on and on about this, but a big problem that we've had for years is seafood fraud, of people swapping species or just telling you untrue things about the age, the date of fish, where it's from, all that fun stuff. So we did just see probably the largest seafood fraud, one of the larger seafood fraud exposés just got revealed this summer in the Associated Press by a Brooklyn group, a broker who was just, you can Google search it or find it on the Associated Press.
Called Sea to Table.
Sea to Table. And, they were just engaging in the worst of the worst practices and got caught. So
tell us what those practices actually were. So they would catch a fish from somewhere else and then relabel it and give us an example.
So they got caught mislabeling farmed fish for wild fish. They got mislabeling imports for domestic. They had just created a whole marketing facade to the public that we saw that facade, and it was very, very good. They have great PR companies and great websites and things like that. But if you worked in the industry, on the other side, you were able to see whoa, there's an enormous disconnect between what they were telling the public, what they were actually...
So you're saying they would market a yellowfin tuna or something like that as local and caught off of Montauk last week when there hadn't been any tuna there for months.
The harbor would be frozen, there would be nobody fishing, and these guys would have, just impossible fish in impossible times. That's when the public started catching on to it, but people in the industry knew about that for a long time. And so what that caused us to do years ago was to begin on a very aggressive track for traceability, but to do it in a way that couldn't be tampered with. So there's a lot of QR codes and things out there, and kind of some of them are faux efforts that are actually worse. They dupe you into, you think you're using tracking or reliable traceability, but it's not. So we got together with Mikkel Bakker, who was the leader of Google Foods at the time, and a bunch of just great scientists, Carl Safina, Paul Greenberg, and we just started to poll and talk to all these people about what would a futuristic system look like for seafood traceability. And it was Bakker who came up with the idea to have live tracking. So we did an old school Kickstarter 2 years ago and put together all the best of the ideas that we could, and we came across a company called Pelagic Data Systems. So their
chief scientist and COO is a badass young woman marine biologist.
Yes, she is, Melissa Guerin. And so we reached out to them, and we got a hold of Fish Tracks, which is a standard kind of fisheries.
Do you have a graphic for
database, and we created the first live tracking system ever for wild seafood. So we have these tracking devices on our vehicles and our vessels. So we now on our website have a dashboard where we do tracking events. You can actually see, this was Mikkel Backer's idea too, to have a progress bar. But you can see fishing in progress, arrived at dock, fish in transit. It's very high resolution, so you can zoom in. You can actually tell what kind of fishing is going on. And so kind of we stumbled into suddenly being celebrated as the leaders, and this really being a precursor to blockchain, which is something we're now really aggressively pursuing as well. But ultimately, the future of seafood is traceability. You absolutely have to put that first and foremost, because things like seafood fraud, even the most educated consumer, I have personally been in situations where I'm like, oh, is it real or is that fake? And it's very, very difficult to tell. There's just a lot of great illusions out there. So traceability is the future, and I think ultimately at the end of the day, know your fishermen. The whole mantra that we've kind of tried to insert into the fisheries space is proving itself to be true.
Great. So we'd love to take your questions. Please don't ask why I'm not also wearing a blue baseball cap. It's just not compatible with my hairdo. But all other questions are welcome.